All right, so Angular. So Angular is an open source framework that was created by folks at Google, and it's a much broader framework than what we've seen in React. It kind of takes over a lot of the things that you need to build from scratch on React, or that you have to build for yourself. Angular has actually templates and opinions of how things should be built. Like for instance, a design pattern that you're kind of free to do whatever you want in React, such as web services. Even though it's a good practice that create a web service, React doesn't really have an opinion on what you do with a web service. It doesn't really care how you talk to the database or to a server, how you fetch data. It's not React's business, right? React just cares that you give it data, you give it some state. Right? Whereas Angular actually does have an opinion on how that should occur. Right? So in that sense, Angular has quite a broader set of opinions on how your application should be built. Right? For instance, it follows the design pattern of model view controller. Right? That your application is complex enough that it should have an architecture. Okay? That you should distinguish between the different tasks of building your application. That that there are different concerns of how you render things or you present things to the user. There are separate concerns on how you implement the logic, right? And you handle events. And there's separate concerns on how you talk to the service and how you cache that information and whatnot, and how you also structure and represent the data and the relationships between that data. And then these are all distinct concerns that have their own challenges. They're complex enough to have their own bucket of concerns, and that it should all be treated differently, and they have different techniques and different things to think about. And React is a much smaller. It's not. I guess folks don't even consider a framework. Consider just a library, right? That simplifies building user interfaces, right? That everything else on how you maintain state, how you represent models, how you cache things, how you talk to the services. That's all you can do whatever you want, right? With even just plain old JavaScript if you want, right? It doesn't have an opinion on any of that, whereas Angular does. So the reason the Angular is here, in the middle of the course as opposed to be earlier, Angular is considered to be a much harder framework to get into, right? That has a much steeper learning curve, and so the intent was to introduce you to a lot of the concepts all throughout the semester of services and rendering and whatnot, and single page application and maintaining state on the client. Introduce you to all those concepts, which hopefully, now that we're in Angular, I don't have to cover any of that. You understand a lot of those concepts, so hopefully the learning curve in Angular is going to be much shallower, right? You already know those concepts. A lot of things are going to be much easier to capture. But I think we would have started with Angular, would have been a much harder trek up. All right. Yeah. So Angular is as I mentioned, it's a TypeScript framework. So it uses a superset of the JavaScript language. This is with the intent that we want to work with serious full-featured programming languages that have a lot of the features that we've come to learn and love about other frameworks, full-featured frameworks, full object-oriented support, being able to make things private and public, that you can extend, that you can implement interfaces, implement singletons. A lot of the same techniques and that have been common on server-side programming such as injection and singletons and factories and all sorts of many of these design patterns that became familiar, became popular on server-side programming, are now finding their way to the client side. Right? Client-side development has become complex enough that it needs these abstraction layers. That it needs these ways of dealing with complexity. Right? So you'll see a lot of injection, a lot of inversion of control, a lot of these ideas that were popular 10 years ago on server side, in Java and .NET and other frameworks, now making their way into client-side development. Right? So if you're old enough you have done a lot of server-side development, you'll feel right at home with some of the same ideas on client-side development. Yeah, so a lot of the features, generics, inversion control, strong typing, decorators, lambdas, very very modern programming concepts are making into the framework. Much like React, Angular has its own command line interface that allows you to very quickly create a running application, right, with the bare bones that you need to get started and to get you going, so that you don't have to set up a lot of this stuff from scratch. Very much like React, you program at a high-level language that needs to be compiled down to a much lower level JavaScript that is understood across all browsers. Right? Browsers don't yet fully support some of the programming concepts, and so just like React, we need to transpile, we need to compile the TypeScript that we have here, compile it down to a version of JavaScript that all browsers can understand, right? That is common to most browsers out there. So we're going to be coding in TypeScript, but it's going to when you install the Angular CLI, it installs also the tools that will automatically transpile all your TypeScript down to a low-level JavaScript. So this is going to install the Angular command line interface globally, right? And basically what it does is that it installs this command on your command line, right? So you can now type ng for Angular, and you can create new applications. You can create new components. You can do all sorts of configuration and a lot of admin stuff from your ng command. Right? So here's a really trivial hello world application. You create the application by saying ng and then new, and then the name of the application. Right? This will down. You need to be online. This will download a template project, right? And it will install it locally on your machine with a directory hello world. You just cd to it, and then you can run your application by saying ng serve, and if you want it, it can open the browser for you and point you right directly where it's running. This is identical to saying npm start. The same thing you do for React. This will call npm start, right? And with some other options internally. In React, when you do an npm start, it starts at localhost 3000. In Angular, it starts at 4200. Okay, so every vendor chooses their particular port, right, and takes kind of like ownership of that port. So yeah, let's do that. Where are we? Let's go up one more. So let's go down to webdev. And let's go to fall. And okay, so we have here a couple of applications already. We have a React client. We have a Java server. Several attempts at working at this. So we can now get started with playing around creating our whiteboard, fall 2018, a client, and it'll be an Angular client, all right? It'll be a client that talks to a server. In this particular case, it's going to talk to the same server, the same Java server that we've been playing around with, right? It's going to call the same identical API that the React client is calling, right? But whereas the React client is calling the list of courses because it wants to populate the editor, right? The Angular client is going to call the same identical API, but because we wants to render the course that the student wants to enroll in, okay, or consume or take the course online. Make sense? Right. So let's create our very first ng new, and this will be whiteboard fall 2018. I think this might be too long. Client Angular. Yeah, that's too big. F 2018. There we go. Sorry. So this is compiling quite a few things. It's setting up a watcher that's going to look at a particular directory, see if any file has changed that it needs to transpile and convert down to JavaScript. So let's see. So we just did whiteboard, fall 2018. Oh, did I misspell it? I did. OK, whatever. All right, so here's our whiteboard Angular client. Let's open it up with our trusty WebStorm. Maybe. And let's see what we have in there. While that's loading, we can run this application right from here. We can say ng serve -- open. And this will kick off the Node server that is hosting this application. We'll compile, and we'll open it up at localhost 4200. Maybe. There we go. Yeah. So this is the boilerplate template of the application, right? That you can replace, you can throw away, and start from scratch. Very much like we did for React. Okay. All right. So let's open it up. Let me close this. Close this project, and let's open the new project. And this is at webdev. No, that's not what I meant to do. Close that. My machine's slow today. Open. So webdev 2018 fall. And here's my Angular, that one. OK, so let's see what we have here. So all our source code, well, all our work is going to be done inside of this src source directory. Okay? And actually, most of our work will be done inside of this app directory. Right? Everything else is mostly environment. Setting up your environment. If you need to load individual libraries, you can update it here in your index.html. This is the actual entry point to your application. If you'll see here, there's an app root. Right? So that's certainly not HTML. So some magic will be populating that app root. Right? That will be replacing the content that we have so far. In this particular case, we can navigate to the app root, which happens to be this app component right here. And we'll talk about what a component is. So that app root that we just saw actually matches this selector over here, this selector that says app root. See that? So in that sense, React is a little nicer, right, where you actually can declare your tags, and use them as tags. And that maps to a class that implements that tag. Here you can be the actual name of the tag and the name of the component and the class that implements it don't have to actually match. Right? It's a good practice to make them match, but they don't have to. So for instance, this is the name of the class that implements this component, but I can choose whatever tag I want. I can choose what the tag that implements it. So this app root over here, this app root is declared. That's the tag right here. That's the selector that I want to choose. And then I can map it with the actual HTML that contains the content for that component. Right? It's the HTML. So this is the actual HTML we see that being rendered. Right? This says welcome to whatever. Here are some links, and that's the content that you're seeing here. Okay? We can blow away all this content and just say hello. Right, and it would replace that content with whatever content you put in there. Right, so that's the entry point. So let's talk about a little bit about what we mean by a component. Right, let's talk about what we mean by component. So all the development in Angular revolves around components. Right, components are kind of the building blocks of an Angular application. It's roughly maps to what you might consider in React the elements, right? Whether it's stateless element or stateful elements, right? It's basically a class. But whereas in React, you have both logic and content as part of the same file, right? Where you might have event handlers in there, you have a constructor. You have maybe a render function in there. And then in the render function, you have the actual content that gets rendered. Right? Angular takes a different approach and says, no, I'm going to follow the model view controller much more strictly, and I'm going to separate those two things. Right? Coding the logic in itself, it's fairly complex. And rendering is also fairly complex. So what they do is they split this into two and say, well no, we're going to put everything that has to do with rendering in a separate file. Right? Ideally, it'll be an HTML file. And whereas we're going to have all the logic in a class, in a Java class. Right? And they should not mix. Right? There should be a distinct interface between the two so that they don't have to mix. You can mix them. Right? You can actually embed HTML in your components, but it's usually considered bad practice, unless it's something that's so trivial, right? That's just a header or something very, very trivial. But typically, you would split them into two files. But nevertheless, they're considered to be a single component. A component is made up of 4 artifacts, right? The TypeScript or JavaScript, where you typically have all the data representation, all the structures, all the logic, all the manipulation of the data in the TypeScript. Then you have in HTML, you have everything that has to do with rendering the content. Although it's expanded HTML, so it's a version of HTML that it's annotated or it's decorated with attributes that allow it to be more than just plain old HTML. For instance, you can have iterations in here, for loops. You can have conditionals. You can have all sorts of logic in here that is not meant to calculate anything. It's meant for layout purposes. Right? It's any computation, any serious computation would occur in a TypeScript. And ideally, what would happen is that TypeScript calculates some Java object, some object representation. And that object representation is shared amongst both the HTML and the TypeScript, right? And once and the HTML would be able to see that JSON representation, and it would render the page according to that Java object that you give it. So the idea would be that it's very object oriented. Right? Any manipulation you do to the object here in the TypeScript side immediately gets reflected in re-rendering of the DOM. Okay, it does not have the same perhaps optimizations that React has with like a virtual DOM and making sure that you're not rendering more than you need to render, right? So in that respect, React folks might have an advantage there, although that is completely transparent, right, to the developer, right? And certainly newer versions of the implementation will certainly, I imagine, copy from each other. I'm sure React and Angular will be, copying from each other quite a bit. Also, part of the component, we have also the CSS style sheet, right? That also can have some logic in there, and also a test file that allows you to unit test your component. Yeah, so the framework is big on testing, right? Being able to independently test your component outside of any other dependencies with other components in the application. Yeah, so when we create our application from scratch, the application, the template creates the root component, right? This app.component.ts, right, is the root component, right? And it has the 4 elements, right? The CSS, the HTML, the TS specification file, and the action component. Okay. Additional to that, we have a modules component, which is kind of an administration configuration bootstrap object. Right. Here's where you configure a lot of the big portions of the application. Right. A lot of the Angular, like React, is fairly complex, and it's big enough that it splits a lot of its features into multiple libraries, and that you then need to import specifically. Right? Same thing with Angular. Angular has a core set of functionality, but not all the functionality is available out of the box. You need to import certain things to make them available. For instance, one of the things that are not available is dealing with forms, with input fields and drop downs and whatnot. Right? So we're going to have to come back to this app.module, right, and specifically load libraries, import libraries that are specific to handling forms, for instance. Right? Another couple things here. Well, obviously, it loads the core modules. Here's loads the browser module, meaning already looking into trying to make the rendering engine, right, specific or independent of whatever device you're using to render or view your application. In this particular case, we are rendering in a browser. Right? So the browser module is loaded here because presumably you're going to be rendering to a browser. But ideally, this would give them an architectural capability of loading other modules, right, for targeting mobile applications and native devices and whatnot. Okay, so again, this app.module.ts is where you load and bootstrap a lot of the services, common services across the entire application. Right, we'll come back to this when we need to load specific things. But nevertheless, the entry point here is this component.html. Right, this is where everything gets started. All right? Okay. All right, so let's create our very first hello world component.